Okay, and we are live on Facebook. Great pleasure today to have my good friend Saleem Trice here again for another New Jersey Constitution Republican virtual conversation. Saleem, how are you today?
I'm good, JR. How you doing today?
Very good. See, I think spring is right around the corner, Saleem, and we can get the temperatures warmed up, and I think that'll make everybody a little happier.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's definitely getting warm over here, and that's very much needed after the snowstorms and the cold weather we done had. It definitely feels good to get some sunshine and warm weather. Absolutely.
And of course, everybody's got cabin fever because of the pandemic. So I think this year it's even more, people are more ready for spring than they've ever been. So it's great to have you on the show, Saleem. Now, tell us a little bit about, we had a great show a couple of months ago. And tell the people a little bit about yourself who may not be familiar with you and your very special podcast, the Smoke and Mirrors podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. So my name is Saleem Trice. I'm originally from Jersey City, New Jersey. Uh, I currently operate a podcast by the name of Smoke and Mirrors, where we deal with political and economic issues. We invite guests from many walks of life, many backgrounds, uh, many educational experience from education itself to finance to economics to politics. Uh, One of the new areas that we're starting to tap into with the guests is we're starting to usher in a plethora of guests that have experience in military law, international arms conflict to be exact. And what it is just to show or just to demonstrate a highlight on how the international setting most of the times, or at times for lack of better words, dictates and determines the political formation of domestic policy. So that's pretty much what I have going on the podcast section. We do it. We pretty much do it every week, or we try to commit to doing it every week. However, situations occurred, so we kind of had to put it on hold. But it's starting to resurface back again, so that's a good thing. I'm really excited about that. But also another thing is a research think tank. Um, we're, on me personally, I'm starting to open up a research think tank. It's been in the works for about, it's been in the works for many years. And I've just been going hard at it more so than ever for the past three. It's starting to come into fruition. Progress is being made. Uh, Networks are being established. And right now we're talking on perhaps establishing it in DC. So that's pretty much what I have going on in the front. I hope everybody tune in. I hope everybody pay attention and look out for me and look out for the things that I may have coming down the pipe.
Right now, Saleem, how can the people get to the podcast? Is there address? You also put it up on your Facebook page too, personal page, correct?
That is correct. They can look at my personal page or my Facebook, and they can see the announcements that's being made in terms of the upcoming podcast. Or what they can usually do is go on my Facebook, scroll down. They can hear some previous podcasts that I did, also with some guests that I may have had, and that's pretty much how they stay tuned right now to up and coming podcasters that I that I plan on having.
And a endeavor that you and I are going to share, as well as
18.
others, is the 1865 project, which we think is very important to provide the accurate history that occurred as a result of Reconstruction. Um, there's a lot of misunderstandings involved with that period of time, and there's a lot of history that has been unfortunately deliberately ignored that we want to bring out. And you actually want to turn the project into a documentary. And I'm thrilled to be part of that with you. We're going to be working on that together. That's something that's very dear to my heart because, as you know, Saleem, we created the New Jersey Constitution Republicans as a group that would restore the initial principles of the Republican Party, the party of emancipation, the party of freedom, the party of liberty, the party of justice, the party of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, the party that believed that the self-evident truth that all men are created equal is indeed needs to be restored, and that we need to talk more about that. Our conversations, not only our conversations, but conversations throughout the country should be talking about those great high universal principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence. And we believe it was indeed the Republican Party and the Union and the federal unions, those who wanted to preserve the Union, but also were more importantly interested in abolishing slavery and giving justice to the captured Black slaves who were sold into slavery over to this country. We believe that it was very, very important as the abolitionist part of the party that we succeeded. By God's mercy, he gave the great gift and he gave the victory. And we believe that it's important that people understand that it was Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party that basically literally fulfilled the idea that the self-evident truth of all men are created equal, became a reality many, many decades after it was written down, when it wasn't that way, or it wasn't an actual or factual statement, but it became much more so with the winning of the Civil War, with the abolishment of slavery, and that in itself giving credence and putting teeth into the remark or into the quote, the self-evident truth that yes, indeed, all men are created equal, and no one is created to rule or oppress another man. No one is created to rule over someone unless that person consents to be ruled that way. And most people aren't going to do that. So these are very, very important principles. And this is why you and I have kind of come together and become good friends and brothers, as we call ourselves brothers from another mother. And
That's
we
right.
genuinely believe that because we have the same ambition. And we're going to talk about it today. What we consider, we asked the question, what is justice? And explain for the audience, Saleem, what the topic is that you picked today that we wanted to discuss.
The topic that I selected today was the role and purpose of government.
Yep.
I think the role and purpose of government is an extremely important topic to have, largely because it percolates into the current times of today, in terms of executive orders, legislation on a state and federal level, as well as on a local level, in terms of police powers, emergency powers, everything that pretty much has been taking place for the last year in particular, but also prior to the last year, for the past century. So I think the role of government was extremely important to have in terms of a discussion to highlight issues that continue to plague not just inner city communities, but I'm a man that primarily focuses on inner city communities because that's where I come from. But it's to highlight those issues that are problematic to those communities and that remain to be. And just to kind of give a brief political education on the purpose and the role of government and how was government instituted and where do they derive their rights from. So I think that's a very important discussion to have, and I look forward to having it, sure.
Yes, it's a great topic, and I was really thrilled when you sent me the invitation suggesting that we have this program we talk about. And we were going to have another gentleman join us as we had advertised, but he wasn't able to be with us today. But hopefully he'll join us next time.
Hopefully.
But right, but and in regards, and this is very important to the constitutional Republican movement, is the inner cities. And traditionally and historically, for a long time now, the Republican Party has, unfortunately, in many instances, ignored the inner cities. They've been dominated, of course, by the Democrats and as representative government. But we think that that can change, and we're working hard to change that. We believe that we can indeed cultivate relationships within the inner cities. And as we've talked about before, Saleem, we believe that we know that there are conservatives and those who are of a traditional, who believe in traditional liberalism or classical liberalism, as we all do, who are in the cities, and they just need some support. And it's gentlemen like yourself, Saleem, that give them the hope and the courage to stand up and say, yes, there is a better way in which government can work in the inner cities.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's something that I relentlessly try to do. Um, is just to create an opportunity to where they can be heard. Right. I think a lot of times, well, I don't think, I know. A lot of times what happens is we still as an inner city community have not yet learned how to play politics. In a sense that we don't understand that your political ideology is not necessarily supposed to be beholden to a party or an individual. It's supposed to be beholden to something that is used to measure a party or an individual.
Mm-hmm.
So you take the constitutional Republicans, for an example, what y'all use to measure government, to measure individuals that are representations of the public. Y'all use the Constitution. And y'all also use the Declaration of Independence. That's the
Mm-hmm.
yardstick. That's the yardstick that y'all select to measure the do's and don'ts of the political representatives, right? So it's not just so much of what you're doing for me or what you should be doing for me, but also what you should not be doing, right? And I think that
Right.
we have gotten away from that. So in order to restore justice, and you can define that how you want to define it, but in order to restore justice, the first thing you have to do is you have to create an opportunity in these type of communities where people are being heard so that
Mm.
you won't be taken advantage of. If Democrats or Republicans, whichever one they may be, if they know that you are beholden to them, that gives them the incentive to not do nothing for you. And as a result, what you do is you incentivize the mediocrity and you incentivize the destabilization of your community. Because what you're indirectly telling the party that's in position is that you don't necessarily have to look at my needs. You don't necessarily have to pay attention to my needs. The only thing you have to do is present the illusion that you are doing something for me, and I will automatically vote for
And as we ask that question of what is the purpose of government, Saleem, it's important for the people in the inner cities, for the people who live out in the country, for the people who live wherever they may live in this nation. It's imperative that they know what the purpose of government is. And I think, Saleem, that if we had 25 people in a room together with us and we asked them what is the purpose of government, I'm confident that we would probably get 25 different answers. And that itself is a problem because people do not understand what the purpose of government. Now, I propose what historically our Republican founders proposed, specifically Abraham Lincoln, and what the founding fathers understood uh, is articulated. What they believe the purpose of government is articulated in the Declaration of Independence, talking about the fact that yes, we're all created equal. That means equal application of the law should be given to all people indiscriminately. The same law applies to everyone indiscriminately, protecting all indiscriminately. And that word protection is going to come back. But also the fact that God has given us certain unalienable rights among these. And then interestingly enough, we often forget the word among these because it does imply that there may be more, but the core three are life, liberty, and the ability to pursue your own happiness. The government can't give you happiness. All they can do is provide the environment from which you can acquire and earn your own happiness. But the purpose of government, as they saw, as Lincoln also reestablished prior to the Civil War and talking about and readopting the principles of the Declaration of Independence, was that the purpose of government was to secure these rights. And for that purpose, governments are instituted among men. So the government's purpose is to secure your rights. So security has a lot to do with what the government is supposed to be doing. Now, the founders thought, first of all, that the government had to secure your life, meaning that certain protections were needed to put up to protect your life, because they understood that man's sinful nature was one in which man, in his inhumanity towards his fellow man, will kill his man. I mean, we read the very first two brothers, Abel and Cain. Abel killed his brother immediately, right away. The first family, the first brothers, one brother kills another. So this propensity exists in every human being, this innate nature. And that is why it's important. Number one, the purpose of government is to protect the person. And this is the beginning of it. But I'd like you to, what are your thoughts on that as being the first purpose of government, to protect the person?
I'm ideologically in line with that premise. I'll also acquiesce to that premise as well. However, there's a critique to that others make. For example, when you articulate that they must, create an environment that gives the people an opportunity to pursue happiness. Now the question becomes, in order to create that environment, they have to regulate it, right? Because that's the ideological premise that others operate from. And that is that, well, we can't create an environment to give someone an opportunity if we don't have the authority to regulate it. So they'll use that provision in the Declaration of Independence to authorize, or to give authorization rather, to regulating the environment. And you can exercise that to the 10th degree in terms of regulating the water, in terms of regulating housing, in terms of regulating this, and in terms of regulating that and regulating that. And what happens is you start to get to the point where, once again, every activity that dominates the well-being of the human being is regulated by government. And they'll use that provision, as stated before, to justify that. So I guess my retort to that would be, what is it that we understand from that provision of creating an opportunity for people to pursue happiness? Is it supposed to be understood the way that is being understood now, which is massive regulation on the environment? Not to mention, the environment is broad. It's not necessarily defined in a restrictive sense. It's broad. Environment could be political environment, it could be social environment, it could be economic environment, financial environment. I mean, family environment. It can be everything. So how do you now start to, introduce something, or introduce a way of thinking that kind of put a check on that kind of, I don't want to say extremism, but kind of put a check on that type of, ideological blunder? for lack of better word.
Yeah, yeah, you make some good observations, Saleem. And I think one thing that we need to remember, and this often gets forgotten, is the importance of self-governance. And I think that the founders and the writers of the Declaration and the Constitution had a much better awareness of self-governance, and this was attributed to, um, of course, Abel, in killing his brother Cain, exercised no self-governance. He acted on his passion, on his sinful nature. He didn't he didn't restrain himself through self-governance. And this is what's so important for each individual, to remember that we have to exercise our own self-governance. And what's interesting to note, in a broader sense too, Saleem, is that when God told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over all of the earth, meaning that human beings, would be in charge. They were given stewardship of the earth. But what's interesting, Saleem, is that God never told Adam that he would have dominion over his fellow man. Then, of course, we see without any type of civil government, and with the lack of self-governance amongst the people, the self-governance of the people individually, we see where sin and wickedness abounded so bad that God caused a great flood and destroyed the world by water. And he only saved one particular family. And then after that flood, that family was again given the same commandment by God as he did with Adam. And he told Noah and his family to be fruitful and to multiply and replenish the earth, meaning that they were to go out and spread. And then, very interestingly, God sets up the first commandment of civil government. And that was when he said, "For whoso sheds man's blood, so shall by man his blood be shed." That was the first civic institution instituted. This wasn't God saying that man was to have dominion over his fellow man. That was never given. But he was saying that man must regulate himself, and the first thing that must be stopped, is murder. And that's why capital punishment, which is what that was, the first institute of civil government, was indeed capital punishment. Now, today we take a total different mindset on capital punishment. But when God said that whoso sheds man's blood, so shall by man his blood be shed, he said, "For in the image of God made he man." So there was the reason why this capital punishment had to be instituted. This is an example, Saleem, of justice. The real first justice was the fact that God was saying every human being's life is so important. Man has no right to take the life of another man premeditated, on purpose. There was going to be examples of manslaughter, and there will be accidents, and there will be wars throughout our history. But the fact is that God did not. The first act of civil government he instituted was capital punishment. And today we take this attitude, well, we have to turn the cheek, or we take the attitude that the murderer is a victim himself, more so even than the victim who dies at his hands. I mean, this is backwards thinking, and it's illogical. But what it gets down to, Saleem, is that when we say the capital punishment is it's archaic, it's inhumane, what we're telling God is that we know better than you, God, and we're not going to have capital punishment because we can do it differently. We can engineer it all differently. And that has been a failure, a total abysmal failure. And that's why, Saleem, we have so little regard for human life. Look at the millions of children that are aborted. Look at how we take for granted life the way we do. And this is because we don't revere and respect life. And that was the first, preserving life was the first purpose of government. And God even showing it through instituting the first civil institution of government, being capital punishment.
The Here's the issue, JR. Historically, man has always had a problem with regulating himself or herself. Right.
Right.
I mean, I think that's I mean, that's the natural disposition. That's the natural disposition that man was created on.
No
Man
question.
has vices, you know, the jealousy, the envy. That's something that is a natural disposition of man. That's his natural disposition. So you're going to have that, right? And now the fact that you're going to have that, some can argue, automatically necessitates a a formation of government, right? The fact that you're always going to have a challenge with man being able to regulate him or herself, and the fact that you're always going to have a situation where jealousy, envy is going to create the context for situations like murder, for situations like robbery, for situations like rape or burglary, whatever classification or whatever term you want to put on it. But the fact that you're always going to have that, because you have historically always had it, the need for government is automatically created. It's necessitated by virtue of the condition of man. Now the
Hmm.
question becomes, to what end? To what end is government supposed to serve? And one, keeping those vices in check, or regulating them to the point where you are able to maintain a civil society and maintain a degree of harmony. That right there is the problem that we have today. That right there is the problem that we have today with government. And they, once again, you can exercise that premise all day long. If you don't have limitations within the limitations, then you can exercise the extremism all day long. You can exercise the extremes all day long. To what end is government supposed to be regulating your life? And to what end, or what vices they can use to regulate your life?
Hmm.
You know, if you go back to the, you go back and you look at issues like the executive order. Executive orders are very important because those orders carry with them the potential to dictate and determine social policy, also to change the direction of social behavior, right? So those things are important. But now the question is, to what legitimate right does government have the authority to do that? That's and the reason why is because if you understand that, if you understand that, then you can begin to question the basic principle or the basic legitimacy of government. It's nothing wrong with questioning the actions of government. You're supposed to.
Hmm.
It's the only
Yeah.
way that you're able to engage in the political landscape to determine whether or not government is fulfilling its duty to you or its responsibility to you. So once again, to what degree and to what end? And if you're looking at the vices that's being used to regulate such behavior, I don't know. I think they're extremely questionable. I don't even know whether they're constitutional, but some would argue they are. So I mean, I would like to kind of punt that question back off to you in terms of let's 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 take one example that government may regulate a person's life and ask ourselves, is that the role? Because a part of understanding the role of government is you have to understand what's not the role of government. So take an executive order, for example. To what end or to what legitimate right is established to support that right? I will punt that question to you because, I think when it comes to constitutional matters, you have much more political undergirding than I.
Well, I wouldn't say that, Saleem. You do just fine, and you know as much of, and I learn a lot from you. So um, I would, but what I in relation to the question on executive orders, and you say, well, what gives the government the right? So we could say here in New Jersey, what gives the governor the right to shut down an economy and to tell small business owners that they can't go to work and they can't earn a living and maintain property and possess property, which is which is the Article 1 of the New Jersey Constitution, gives everybody the right to do that. So what comes along that would retract that right? What comes along that could usurp that constitutional right? And the believers in executive orders say, well, the executive order. Now we know that the language executive order, that phrase, is not found in our state constitution. I don't believe it's found in any state constitution. It's certainly not found in our federal constitution. And the whole idea of an executive order, as we were talking about a night or two ago, was there were executive orders. Washington initiated, George Washington, our first president, initiated orders, but those orders only were applicable to those within his administration, not as they didn't carry the force of law. We read in the Constitution.
Sorry to cut you off, Jay.
No, not a problem.
When you say only relevant or only applicable to those in his administration,
right?
To what extent of his administration? Do you mean those that was just within his cabinet, or do you mean within his cabinet and beyond, meaning federal employees, you know, so on and so forth? Or is it just
right
pertaining to the cabinet?
Right. Well, you have to remember too, as Saleem, that George Washington's administration was minuscule. It was only made up of maybe a dozen or so people, whereas today we have millions of people involved with public administration and bureaucracy, and of course is indicative of the growth of government. And we can argue the constitutionality of that growth of government as well. But his orders, executive orders, would be very benign instances, like making sure everyone in the administration, his cabinet, his secretaries, his administrators, which I said only made up of a few people, had paper and pencil to be able to write down information, or to make sure that they had the right facilities in which to work in which to stay dry, to stay warm, and very, very benign orders that have blown up into a whole that carry the force of law. Like today, I saw where Biden was going to sign an executive order that was going to affect the voting rights. Well, voting rights are up to the states. The states are given constitutionality, that authority, not the president. So here's another example of how executive orders have been completely manipulated and completely blown completely out of proportion. And as we've said, the Constitution vests all legislative power in the legislative body, which is the Congress and the state houses and the assemblies and the state senators at the state level. They are the ones who are exclusively permitted to make law. Now, there are executive orders, one of which was very important to us, was one that Abraham Lincoln instituted with the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, that was indeed a executive order, but the reason he was able to give that executive order constitutionally is because he is considered the commander in chief, and he is responsible for conducting the war. And we were indeed in a war right in our own backyard, in our own soil in this country. And it was a war over slavery. And he knew that politically it was good to emancipate the slaves, because it would hurt the South, because the South were using the slaves to help support their war effort against the Union in the North. And the Confederates considered the black slaves property, not necessarily even human beings. So by Lincoln executing that executive order, he said, stating that all the states that seceded from the Union, all those who were in those states who were slaves, were forever free. They were free. So that means they weren't contraband anymore. That means they couldn't be used officially in trying to help the Confederate war movement. So there's an example of an executive order that was specifically executed as a result of the commander-in-chief responsibilities of the president. And those executive orders are constitutionally viable because he is given certain responsibilities in conducting war. Now, when we have a governor who says that he equates the pandemic to a war, now we're getting into definition of terms. I mean, can we really call a pandemic an act of war or a war? I mean, that's the language they're using, and both sides used it. Trump said it, and so did Murphy and all the other Democratic governors, that this pandemic was a war. So in that case, they say, well, we can use executive orders because this is indeed a war. Well, that's where the courts need to step up and say, listen, we and the legislators need to step up, Saleem, and say, listen, we have to have clear definitions on what constitutes a crisis, what constitutes an emergency, what constitutes a war. We have to have clear, concise definition. That is one thing that we've learned from this pandemic, that we have to get clear definition of terminology because we've seen the abuse of these executive orders to the point where they shut down a businessman's ability or a businesswoman's ability to conduct a living. I mean, look how many bankruptcies have occurred as a result of these executive orders, all done in lieu of a so-called crisis or a war. There needs to be specific legislation dictating and designating what would constitute the act of war or a crisis or an emergency. And this is why it's so important that we first understand what executive orders are. They're not supposed to carry the weight of legislative power. That is vested only in the legislative branch. The president does have executive actions that he must take. And a lot of some of the laws that were passed, there were 2 laws specifically passed in New Jersey that would give the governor the ability to send in law enforcement and emergency personnel in lieu of a threat, in lieu of a terrorist threat, in lieu of an adversarial threat, to whereas you wouldn't have time to go to the state house and to get the legislator to convene and to make decisions. That's where the executive comes in with the ability to make quick decisions. But to give the executive order an all-encompassing application to voter rights or to what's being taught in school or shutting businesses down, these are not constitutional. They're just simply don't.
So let me play devil's advocate a little bit, right? I think on premise, I agree with you. I think where I may be challenged at a little bit is in regards to the issue is the fact that I look at executive orders in terms of emergencies. Like when you mentioned the Lincoln administration and Lincoln executive order that dealt with the Emancipation Proclamation, those are situations of emergency that dealt with a need that immediately needed to be responded to.
Right.
And what many on the left have done is use that terminology to justify the need to issue such an executive order. So they'll just say, listen, the executive order falls underneath emergency powers. It's an emergency. It's an immediate need that needs to be responded to, i.e. a pandemic, i.e. a war, whatever you want to call it. If it in fact reaches the threshold of needing immediate response, it can, to some people, determine that an executive order must be established. This is what they use. Because if not, then how do you maintain law and order? If it's a situation where the law is eroding in front of your very face, and if it's a situation where people's rights are being violated, and the state government, the local government, whatever have you, is not willing to do anything about it, or is inept to the social condition of their constituency, then the federal government has no need but to step in and do what they got to do. Because without them doing that, the alternative is chaos. This is what they're using, and this is what they're using to buffer their argument. And I think it's working to some degree.
Right. Yeah, you make an excellent point, Saleem. There's no question about it. And see, that's why it's so important that we have to define what constitutes an emergency. We have to be specific. Is it an attack? Is it a pandemic? Is it a weather-related instance? Is it an act of nature, act of God? It has to be more specific. That needs to be clearly delineated and define what would constitute the purpose for an executive order.
Now the other thing now is, where does this philosophy come from? Where does the philosophy to govern individuals in this capacity come from? Me and you spoke briefly about this a few days ago, and we went over some of the political philosophy, or also some of the philosophies of historical figures. One of those figures was Darwin. Another one of those figures was Marx. And
right.
I mean, call me what you want. It just seems like a lot of their political philosophy in regards to government rule over its people parallels with that which we are seeing today. And I just want to know, where does that, is that an accurate assessment to make in terms of government operations in today's times? Because we're seeing it now in front of our very eyes in terms of how government is choosing to govern people. And that's important, because how you see people largely determines how you would govern them, how you would service them, what legislation you would use to help them, or in some cases, disarm them. So it's critical. It's very critical. Where does this philosophy come from? I'm puzzled.
Well, this is an example of the headway that's been made with progressivism. And of course, progressivism, Woodrow Wilson was the first real political exponent of progressivism. Teddy Roosevelt was associated with the progressives, but not nearly to the point where Wilson was. Teddy Roosevelt said that anything that's not listed in Article 2 means that I can do whatever isn't enumerated in Article 2, I can do anything else that's not enumerated, which was a total backwards idea of what the founders meant by the enumerated responsibilities, the specific limited responsibilities of a president. Lincoln thought, or not Lincoln, but rather Roosevelt thought that he could take extraordinary and other actions that are not written in the Constitution. That is a form of progressivism. But Wilson said that we look to Darwin, we look to the government as a living, evolving, adapting organism, whereas the founders looked at it very much from a Newtonian, Isaac Newton type of checks and balances, and as he understood the motion of the existence of the solar system with the gravitational pull of the planets in relation to Earth, and the Earth being specifically placed where it is in the universe so that life can indeed exist. So it's a very mechanical means of understanding the way government which should work, as opposed to Wilson's idea, which was derived from Darwin, which was a very living, evolving, changing. You want to offshoot one of your organs. You don't want your heart to be checking and balancing your liver, and your liver checking and balancing your kidney. That is the type of understanding that the progressives had, whereas the founders looked at it more as an organization, more of a machine, more of gears working together in such a way, very predictable, very static, very continues on and on and on. It doesn't change. So with that idea, specifically towards executive orders. There were only so many executive orders. I think Lincoln may have had a few hundred, everyone prior. And of course, they were basically, his orders were more garnered towards the conducting of the war. But then as we see after Wilson, we see FDR, who really, you had Harding and Coolidge. And Coolidge was really the last constitutional Republican, small r and small c, if you will, and capital C and R, that we had, and that he adhered to the constitutional duties given Article 2, that define the responsibilities of the president. And then we have Herbert Hoover, and then FDR comes along. And from hundreds of executive orders, we go into 3,000 executive orders. And this is because they believed in a direct democracy approach to government. They believe that through progressivism, we can work quicker. We can do away with the Congress to a certain degree. We can overlook them. We can appoint judges who will be progressive in their rulings. This is what the idea of FDR wanting to pack the court. We hear that language again today with Biden. So the whole idea is the changing and evolving, making government quicker, and having it work more efficiently. Whereas the founders, Saleem, wanted everything to slow down. They wanted the government to go slow and to deliberate. The House of Representatives would come up with legislation based upon how close they were to the people themselves. Then it goes to the Senate and everything slows down. There's deliberation, there's debate, there's compromise, there's statesmanship, there's moderation that's employed. But direct democracy, progressivism wants to get it done now. And the founders, of course, in the Federalist Papers warned against this government based upon passion, impulse, emotion. That's why they devised the government to be very, very, to try to subvert these natural instincts of men. But the progressivism is really the reason why you see executive orders used the way they are today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And also in the nature that they are used in. The issue is one of the main objectives of the Constitution, as it is understood by many, actually, it's for the most part, it's a consensus in terms of that. One of the primary objectives of the Constitution was to create a system of checks and balances, right? To where you don't necessarily have one branch overriding the other. You have harmony in a system, and that's important because that's what maintains the legitimacy and the integrity of law. And when you have now an executive order, or when you authorize the executive branch, and the president being the head of the executive branch, when you authorize the president to issue executive order that carries the force of law in situations that don't necessarily necessitate an emergency, you defeat the very objective that the Constitution was structured. I mean, it's kind of idiotic for you on one end to say one of the primary objectives of the Constitution is to maintain a system of checks and balances. But in the same breath, or in the same position, you say that the head of the executive branch can issue such executive orders where emergency is not called for, and there's no situation that calls for an emergency. That defeats the whole purpose, or that defeats the whole objective of the Constitution itself. So it's kind of reflective of desire rule politics. You're just ruling politics based on your desire, right? There's no guide, there's no principle, there's no blueprint. It's just it's decisions made off of impulse to influence the political trajectory of the people.
That's right.
Executive heads do it, such as presidents, governors do it. And what happens is once you get a new president, they do the same thing. And they override the previous one. And then the other one come in and then they override the previous one. And politics becomes nothing more than a political circus, which is what it is now. I think the one of the main solutions that I feel that is that there must be a self-determination and a self-motivation to gradually or radically become independent of government in some shape, way, form, or fashion. As long as you depend on a hand that feeds you, you're always gonna rely on them not to stop feeding. You know, whatever
Yeah.
one gives you in one hand, they can take with the other. And as long as you're dependent on a system to give you something, you will completely become reliant. Your self-determination, your self-will will completely erode, and you become nothing.
Right.
You become nothing more than an object or a social animal that's used to serve a political means. So there must be a self-determination to gradually become independent of government. And I don't even argue with people that say to radically become independent of government, because this is not to argue that government is not needed. That's not the argument. The argument is always, in what capacity are they needed, and to what extent are they needed? Anything that has no rule, anything that has no balance, anything that has no limit is extreme by nature. So there must be, as you articulated earlier, there must be some sort of defining moments, right? That you kind of establish to put things in check. Otherwise, otherwise solutions become no solutions.
And this, what you've just said there, Saleem, takes our whole conversation completely full circle back to the purpose of government. And the purpose of government is to protect the person and their property. It's not to do everything else the government has become involved with and doing for people. And largely because of political expedience, because people want to stay in power and they want to get reelected. So they promise the people this and they promise the people that and they promise the people that. But yet they fail to accurately protect the people, especially in our inner cities. The people are not adequately protected and their property is not protected. And this would be, if the founders could come back and they could come back in a time machine and come into our world, and they would hear about the number of homicides in Chicago week after week after week, they would be horrified. They would say the first purpose of this government is to protect all of these people that are being murdered, and the justice is given to those who are doing the murdering. That's why I talked about capital punishment, which was the first instituted civil ordinance, which was for a person to take the life of another, he's forfeited their own. It's that simple.
Yeah,
Tooth
but
for
that's
tooth
being
and eye for eye.
eradicated now too. Capital
Oh,
punishment is being eradicated now.
there's an example. There's an example of progressivism thinking, well, we know better. We're going to change. We're adapting. We know better than that. We know better than God. We don't need God to tell us what to do. We're going to do it. We can engineer these people. We can through our public education system, we can re-engineer them and we can change them. And they deny the very nature of the human being. So they never even get out of the batter's box in that regard. They just stay put. And
So is
that's
it
why
fair to say? So is it fair to say that a large part of progressivism is to make, I don't want to say make, but a large part of progressivism is to coerce the people to become subjective to the state, as opposed to becoming unique people that tap into their own potential and appreciate the differences that God installed.
you just articulated the difference right there. The difference is, now the progressive ideal is very similar to the Marxist and to the communist view of a utopia, some unknown utopia where everyone is going to be or earning the same money. Everyone's going to be, there won't be any need for government even. That's how far communism goes in its fulfillment, which we know it's never worked. It never can work because they deny man's human nature. They believe that man is merely material. as Darwin did. This is why that's why it's very, very similar to what Darwin talked about. So you have the state. Everybody is created. Everyone is thought of and what they can do to contribute to the benefit of the state. That's the progressive view. And then you have the other view, which is the founder's view, which is that of classical liberalism. Liberalism meaning liberty. People are at liberty to do as they choose, and they are educated in such a way that they will be able to come up with their own talents will be manifests. They will be able to achieve their own happiness. They will be able to pursue and achieve their own happiness, as opposed to the state doing it for you in relation to your contribution to the state. It's all entirely up to you. On our side, on the traditional liberal side, it's up to the individual, and this is why self-governance is so important. Abstaining from doing what is wrong, doing what is right. We don't need the state to coerce or to put us in line. We have to start with ourselves. The state exists in the respect that, not the state rather, but government exists to protect you and to minister justice on those who violate your rights. And that's the simple purpose of government. That's very different from the state that has to do everything for you. The state has to teach you. The state will take care of your health care. The state will teach your children. The state will give you a job. The state will give you unemployment benefits. The state will tell you when you can open your business, when you can't, all through direct orders, if you will, or executive orders. We see the big dichotomy that exists between the state, the progressive ideal of trying to create this utopian state, or individual responsibility, individual liberty, individual entrepreneurship, individual traditional liberal values. You're at liberty to do what you want, as long as you're not violating somebody else's rights. And the government's only there to protect you and your property, and to punish those who violate your rights of life and property. It's that simple.
Would you support the proponents that suggest that you need balance? Because although you want to promote individual liberty, and I know we're coming up to the hour, but although that you want to promote individual liberty, that individual liberty, I'm sorry, left unchecked,
Oh, yes.
unfortunately promotes a degree of selfishness.
Oh, yes, no doubt. Washington talked about, you have to give up certain liberties in order to live in a civil society. Now, we're not at liberty to infringe upon our fellow man. We're not at liberty to take their property. We're not at liberty to take their wife. We're not at liberty to harm them. Of course, these are examples of positive and negative liberties. But we're at liberty to do what is right for ourselves and for our fellow man. Of course, we know intuitively that we're to love our fellow man, that we're to consider our fellow man our brother, and we're to look out for him as well. But you talk about the balance that exists. Well, now it's completely out of balance. Now it's completely geared towards progressivism and for government intervention and everything. And the two things that they are supposed to do primarily in protecting the property, then protecting the person, the property, they're inadequate. And then when you hear that there are people who want to eliminate law enforcement and try to cripple law enforcement, this gets contrary to what the very purpose of government was intended to do.
Absolutely.
And then we become more and more, it's indicative of postmodernity, postmodern thought, which has to do with more absurdity than it does common sense. And we need to get back to that common sense and what really truly is the purpose of government. The people have to know what it is, and then the people have to demand it from their representatives. We demand that you take care of our person, our property, and leave us alone outside of that. And that's what the founders talked about.
Gotcha. I agree.
Well,
I agree with that
Saleem,
part.
it's been a great. Well, listen, we're going to do this again. We'll have another conversation coming up. It's great to have you. And if there's any other, how would you like to end our conversation today? Anything you'd like to tell the audience?
Uh, just like to tell the audience, in general, to keep doing what they're doing. I think you have a large audience base that supports you. I would like to just tell the audience to keep patronizing you, keep supporting you, keep listening to you. And people that may not listen to me or may not listen to you, that in order to invoke any sort of political change or any sort of political thought, you need to create an opportunity to where you are listening to what you may consider to be the opposition. Right? I mean, that's the only way that you invoke change or thought. I mean, if this is going to be a situation where you're just listening to one political party, and I don't even like to classify myself as belonging, like I said, to any political party.
Right.
But if it's a situation where the person is typically beholden to one political party, then you become easily predictable and you become nothing more than a subject that is completely brainwashed.
Yeah. Well, it's been great conversation. I hope all of the audience out there will like and share this video, share with others. It promotes thought and thinking, and that's a good thing. And thank you so much, Saleem, for joining me, and thank you for coming up with the topic. And we'll be together soon on another podcast and another New Jersey Constitutional Virtual Conversation very soon. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
Thank you, brother. And thank you all, audience. And remember what Abraham Lincoln said. He said, liberty for all. Thank you.
All right.